There is a particular kind of silence that settles over the American Midwest in the early morning hours of October. Before the sun clears the tree line and before the combines roll out of their sheds, and before the farmers have finished their first cup of coffee, standing at the kitchen window, looking out at fields they have worked for 30 or 40 years and will work until their bodies will not allow it anymore. It is not a peaceful silence exactly. It is a waiting silence. The silence of a place that knows what it is and has always known and has no patience for anything that does not fit. Hardin County, Iowa was that kind of place in 1966. 600 farms stretched across the flat black prairie growing corn and soybeans. The way the land had always grown them generation after generation, the same fields turning over the same crops under the same wide sky. There were two grain elevators, a feed mill, a co-op where the men gathered on Saturday mornings to drink bad coffee and talk about weather and prices and equipment. There was a bank that had been run by the same family since 1921, and there was a John Deere dealership on the main road into Eldora, run by a man named Frank Harmon, who believed with the certainty of a man who had never been seriously wrong about anything that the American farmer's highest calling was to buy new equipment, and that any farmer who thought otherwise was either too poor to matter or too stubborn to survive. Frank Harmon was 51 years old in 1966. He was broad-shouldered loud in the way that salesmen learn to be loud, and he had a handshake that he had practiced until it felt like a closing argument. He had opened his dealership in 1957 with borrowed money and a belief that Central Iowa would keep buying machines for as long as the land kept producing, which was forever. By 1966, he had sold more John Deere equipment in Hardin County than any other dealer in the district. He drove a new truck every 2 years. He had opinions about everything and shared them freely, especially on Saturday mornings at the co-op, where the men who could not afford new equipment listened to him talk about the men who could. Frank Harmon had a particular opinion about Mayholt. He had several, in fact, and he shared them regularly in the particular way that small-town men share opinions about women who do not behave the way small-town men believe women should behave. Not with open cruelty, with amusement, with the tone of a man describing something slightly absurd that he has seen on the side of the road. A funny story, an eyebrow raised, a slow shake of the head that said everything without saying anything that could be directly quoted. Mayholt, Frank liked to say, has got herself a situation out there on the north end. And the men at the co-op would nod because they knew what the situation was. Everybody in Hardin County knew what the situation was. Mayholt was collecting junk. She was 53 years old in 1966, and she had farmed 240 acres on the east side of the county since 1941, the year she and her husband, Gus Holt, had taken over from her father, who had taken over from his father, who had homesteaded that particular piece of central Iowa prairie in 1879. 3 generations of her family on the same ground. The soil was dark and deep, the kind of ground that almost farmed itself if you paid attention and didn't make foolish decisions. May paid attention. She had been paying attention to that land her entire life. She was not a tall woman, but she carried herself like someone who had never needed height to make a point. She had hands that looked like they belonged to someone 20 years older. Rough and deliberate, with grease worked into the creases around her knuckles that no amount of washing fully removed. She wore the same canvas work jacket from March through November, and she had a way of looking at a piece of machinery that reminded people who knew her well of the way a doctor looks at a patient, not with sentiment, but with the focused attention of someone cataloging everything at once. Gus Holt was a different kind of person. He was a quiet man, methodical in a way that was different from May's methodical, where May's precision was driven by something that looked almost like urgency. Gus operated at the steady pace of a man who had decided long ago that most things could wait, and the ones that couldn't would announce themselves clearly enough. He farmed his ground, maintained his equipment, came in for supper when called, and trusted May's judgment on most things without needing to understand the reasoning behind it. This was not weakness. It was a form of wisdom that took most men 40 years to arrive at, if they arrived at it at all. Their son Caleb had come along in the late 1960s, arriving into a household already shaped by 2 people of particular and complementary natures. He was a quiet child who gravitated toward the barn the way other children gravitated toward playgrounds, drawn by the machinery and the ordered purpose of everything in it. He absorbed things by proximity. He asked few questions and forgot nothing. Ruth Dennison lived 2 farms to the north, close enough that she and May had grown up as the kind of neighbors who see each other at the mailbox and at the feed store and at every church social for 40 years without ever becoming exactly close, but with a familiarity that carried its own form of honesty. Ruth was practical and direct and held firm opinions, especially about what was appropriate and what was not. And in 1966, her opinion about what May was doing in that barn was formed quickly and stated plainly. It was too much, it was unnecessary, and it was going to cause talk. Their property had one feature that distinguished it from every other farm in the township: a ravine. It ran for roughly 300 yards along the north boundary of the land, a deep, steep-sided gully carved by a creek that had changed course sometime in the previous century, leaving behind a cut in the earth that was too steep to plant, too rocky to graze, and too irregular to fill in without a significant investment that would never pay for itself. It was by any practical measure wasted ground. May's father had used it as a dump. When a piece of equipment died, it went into the ravine. By the time May took over the farm, there were already a dozen pieces of machinery down there, and relics of her father's farming life, slowly rusting, slowly sinking, becoming part of the landscape, the way old things do when nobody is watching them closely anymore. Most farmers would have called the scrap dealer. May walked down into the ravine instead and started taking inventory. She did this with a clipboard and a spiral notebook, moving from machine to machine, recording what each one was, what year it was made, what she could see about its condition, and what parts were likely still usable. She spent 3 days doing this. Gus watched her from the rim of the ravine the first morning, said nothing, and went back to work on the tractor he was overhauling in the main shed. When May came up for lunch on the third day, she had 12 pages of notes and a look on her face that Gus recognized. It was the same look she got when she had finished figuring out something that had been bothering her for a long time. "There is something worth savings down there," she said. Gus poured himself more coffee and asked how much of it. "Most of it," May said. "Maybe all of it." Gus nodded. He did not ask what she planned to do with it. He had learned over 25 years of marriage that May's plans revealed themselves in their own time, and that asking questions before she was ready to answer them was a reliable way to have a conversation that went nowhere useful for anybody. The plan revealed itself in the spring of 1966 when a farmer named Joe Cutter, who worked 400 acres 2 miles to the west, ran a Farmall 460 into a drainage ditch at the wrong angle and cracked the engine block. The 460 was a good tractor. It had given Joe a decade of solid work. But a cracked block meant the engine was finished, and a tractor without an engine was, in Joe Cutter's estimation, something between a very large paperweight and a very expensive headache. Joe called the scrap dealer. The scrap dealer told him $8 a ton cash, and he'd come out the following week with the flatbed. May Holt called Joe Cutter before the week was out. She had heard about the cracked block the way people heard about things in Hardin County, through the particular information network of a small agricultural community where news traveled at the speed of a phone call and arrived at the co-op fully elaborated before the paint was dry on the original event. May called Joe, asked if she could come and look at the 460 before the scrap man arrived, and drove her truck out to his place the next morning. Joe was standing in his machine shed leaning against a workbench with a cup of coffee and the expression of a man who has already made up his mind and is prepared to be patient with anyone who disagrees. May walked around the tractor twice without speaking. She crouched down and looked at the block. She checked the hydraulic pump, the PTO shaft, the rear end assembly. She ran her hands along the sheet metal, tapped the fuel tank, looked at the gauges. "Joe Cutter," she said, "I'd like to take this off your hands." Joe looked at her the way you look at someone who has said something that doesn't quite parse correctly the first time. "May," he said, "that tractor's got a cracked block. It's finished." "The block's finished," May said. "The tractor is not." Joe set down his coffee and crossed his arms. "There's nothing left worth saving on that machine," he said. "The block's cracked. What are you going to do with the rest of it?" May stood up and looked at him steadily. "The hydraulic pump is good," she said. "The PTO shaft is good. The rear end is good. The gauges work. The seat is fine. The steering column, the fuel injector, the water pump, the brake shoes, all of it is good. One cracked block and does not make a tractor worthless. It makes 90% of a tractor into something that someone is going to need someday." Joe Cutter was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "May, you're talking about hauling a dead tractor to your farm so you can take it apart and put the pieces in your barn. That is exactly what I am talking about, May said. Joe looked at her for another long moment. Then he laughed. It was not a mean laugh. It was the laugh of a man who has encountered something so far outside his frame of reference that laughter is the only reasonable response. He let her take the tractor. It cost Mayholt nothing but an afternoon with a flatbed trailer and a come-along, and by Saturday morning the Farmall 460 was parked beside the main barn on the Holt property, and by Sunday afternoon May had begun disassembling it. She did not use a sledgehammer. She did not cut corners. She worked through the tractor the way a trained surgeon works through a procedure systematically, with reference to the shop manual she had ordered from an agricultural supply catalog, removing each component in the correct sequence, setting it aside cleanly and examining it before deciding what to do with it. Every part that could be cleaned, she cleaned. Every part that could be tested by hand, she tested. Every part that passed her inspection, she labeled. The labels were made from strips of masking tape and a grease pencil. Each strip carried 4 pieces of information: the make of the tractor, the model number, the name of the part, and a one-word assessment of its condition. She pressed each strip carefully onto the part in a location where it would not interfere with the part's function. Then she carried the part into the barn and set it on the shelf she had built along the east wall over the preceding 2 weeks. Gus had built the shelf. May had asked him to, and he had built it without asking why, and it was a solid shelf, the kind of shelf built by a man who understood that shelves need to last. The hydraulic pump from the Farmall 460 went on the middle shelf, second from the left. The PTO shaft went on a wall hook she had installed for that purpose. The fuel injector went into a coffee can, a large Folgers can, with the label soaked off on which May had written in block letters with a black marker, IH 460 injectors. The water pump went into a box labeled IH Water Pumps 300 to 460 series. The gauges, the brake shoes, the steering components, the smaller hardware, of it organized, labeled, and stored with a precision that would have impressed a supply officer in any branch of the military. The frame of the tractor, the cracked block, and the sheet metal went into the ravine. May organized them. Frame on one side, sheet metal stacked flat, block upright, standing next to 2 other blocks that had been rusting in the ravine since her father's time. That was how it started. Word spread the way things spread in farming communities, not through any advertising or announcement, but through the simple mechanism of men talking to other men about practical problems and practical solutions. Joe Cutter mentioned to his neighbor that Mayholt had taken his dead Farmall. The neighbor mentioned it at the feed mill. Someone at the feed mill mentioned it at the co-op. By the end of the summer, half the township had heard some version of the story, which had by that point gone through enough retellings to acquire a few details that hadn't been in the original. But the core of it was accurate. Mayholt was taking dead equipment. If you had something broken and you didn't know what to do with it, you could bring it to her. Within 2 years, farmers from across the township were bringing their broken, obsolete, and worn-out machinery to the Holt property. A combine header with bent teeth, a grain drill with a seized gearbox, a manure spreader with a rotted floor, 2 more tractors, a Farmall H with a blown head gasket, and an Oliver 70 with a cracked manifold, a hay baler that had been sitting behind a barn for 11 years, 3 plows with broken shares, an entire set of cultivator shovels from a field cultivator that nobody made replacement parts for anymore. May said yes to every piece that arrived. She did it without ceremony, without negotiation, and without the kind of elaborate gratitude that would have made the farmers uncomfortable. When someone pulled into her lane with a dead machine on a trailer, she walked out, looked at what they had, and told them where to put it. That was the transaction. Simple. Clean. No money changed hands in either direction. She spent her evenings in the barn. While Gus watched the news and young Caleb did his homework at the kitchen table, May was in the barn with the work light on, disassembling, cleaning, testing, and labeling. She developed a system for the coffee cans that allowed her to find any small part within 30 seconds of being asked for it. She developed a system for the larger parts on the shelves that organized everything by brand first, then by model series, then by function. She kept a spiral notebook, a simple lined notebook from the drugstore in Eldora, in which she recorded every part she acquired, the date it arrived, who brought it, what machine it came from, what condition it was in, and where she had stored it in the barn. By 1970, the notebook listed 412 parts. May knew this because she counted them. She counted everything. Now you have to understand what Hardin County made of all this because the reaction is half the story and in some ways the more important half. Frank Harmon made it personal first. Frank was not a man who tolerated competition quietly, and he had decided early on that what May Holt was doing in that barn was a form of competition, even if it didn't look like any competition he had previously encountered. Every used part she pulled from a dead machine was a new part he didn't sell. Every farmer who drove to the Holt place instead of his showroom was a customer he lost to a woman in a canvas jacket who charged nothing and worked by candlelight in a barn full of labeled coffee cans. He didn't say this directly. That was not how Frank Harmon operated. What he said on Saturday mornings at the co-op was this: May Holt's got a genuine situation out there on the north end. I drove past last Tuesday and counted 14 dead tractors lined up along that ravine of hers. I counted 6 combine frames. And I believe I saw what was left of a threshing machine from before the war. It's an eyesore. It's a safety issue. And every farmer in this county who drives out there and puts a used hydraulic pump on his tractor instead of buying a new one from a licensed dealer is doing himself a disservice and doing this community a disservice. The men at the co-op murmured. Some nodded. A few said May wasn't hurting anyone. Franken meant it, but said it quietly in the way you say things quietly. When the man you're disagreeing with controls the parts counter, you are going to need access to before the next planting season. What nobody said out loud, but what was present in the room, the way furniture is present, is simply there. Part of the arrangement was that the deeper issue for Frank was not the used parts. It was May herself. A woman who had decided without asking anyone's permission or seeking anyone's approval to build something in her barn and her ravine that the men of Hardin County had not built, had not thought to build, and could not now build because she had already built it. That was the thing Frank Harmon could not say out loud. So he talked about eyesores and safety hazards and the proper way to run a business, and the men at the co-op nodded and May Holt kept working. Ruth Dennison told May directly what she thought, which was the kind of honesty that long neighborly acquaintance permits. She said it one evening when she stopped by and found May in the barn relabeling a set of Oliver brake drums while Gus sat on an upturned bucket nearby saying nothing. Ruth stood in the doorway and told May that people were talking that the kids on the school bus had started calling it the junk farm, that it was causing more embarrassment than it was worth. May listened without interrupting. When Ruth finished, May looked up from the brake drum. Are they wrong to call it that? May said. Ruth considered it. No, she said, but that's not the point. That is exactly the point, May said and went back to the label. Ruth drove home without saying anything more. She did not fully understand what May was doing. But she had known May Holt long enough to know that when May said something was exactly the point, the conversation was finished, and that arguing further was an investment that would not pay. Caleb grew up in the barn the way some children grow up in libraries or workshops or ballparks, absorbing everything by proximity, understanding things before he had the language to explain how he understood them. By the time he was old enough to be useful, he could tell the difference between a Farmall 460 hydraulic pump and a Farmall 560 hydraulic pump without looking at the label. May was sending him into the barn to locate specific parts while she finished other work outside, and he came back with the right part every time. He had his father's quietness and his mother's eyes, the same focused cataloging attention that could look at a piece of machinery and read it the way other people read words on a page. May noticed this. She said nothing about it, but she noticed. In the fall of 1972, a complaint was filed with the Hardin County Zoning Office. The complaint was anonymous, which meant that officially no one knew who had filed it. Unofficially, there were perhaps 6 people in the county who had any reason to file it, and 5 of them had no particular grievance with May Holt. The 6th was Frank Harmon, though this was never proven, and Frank never confirmed it, and May never accused him directly. The complaint alleged that she was operating an unlicensed commercial salvage yard on agricultural land in violation of county zoning ordinances. It requested an inspection, and if the violation was confirmed, enforcement action up to and including mandatory cleanup of the site. Gary Meeks was the county zoning officer. He was a practical man, the kind of man who had taken a county job because it offered stability and modest satisfaction, and occasionally let him drive around the county looking at interesting things which he genuinely enjoyed. He called May, told her about the complaint, and asked if he could come out and take a look. She said yes. He arrived on a Tuesday morning and found May in the barn reorganizing the section she had dedicated to Oliver tractor parts, following the arrival of 3 more Oliver machines in the past month. She was wearing her canvas jacket and her good boots, and she had grease on her left hand and a grease pencil behind one ear. She shook his hand, showed him the notebook, and walked him through the barn before he asked to see it. Gary Meeks spent 40 minutes in that barn. He looked at the shelves. He looked at the labeling system. He looked at the coffee cans and the cardboard boxes and the wall hooks, each item marked with its make, model, part, name, and condition. He looked at the cross-referencing system May had developed in the notebook, which allowed any part to be located from 3 different starting points, by brand, by model, or by function. He had inspected 3 implement dealers in the county as part of his ordinary duties, and none of them were organized like this. He walked the ravine afterward with May beside him. She had organized the equipment, carcasses in rows sorted by manufacturer. International Harvester on the north side, John Deere on the south, miscellaneous in the middle. Within each row, the machines were arranged roughly chronologically. Even the dead equipment had a system. Gary Meeks looked at his clipboard for a moment. "Mrs. Holt," he said, "I have to ask you plainly, are you buying and selling equipment parts for profit?" "I am not buying anything," May said. "Farmers bring me equipment they cannot use and do not want. I take it apart and keep the usable parts. When a neighbor needs a part, I give it to them or trade for something useful. I have not charged money for a part yet. I do not advertise. I do not have a business license because I am not running a business. I am a farmer with a barn and a ravine and a system." Gary looked at the ravine again. "You've got more parts in that barn than Harmon Implement," he said. May looked at him. "Frank Harmon charges 300% over cost," she said. "I charge nothing. The comparison you are making is not the one that applies here." Gary Meeks wrote something on his clipboard. He nodded. He drove away. The complaint was filed as no violation found. But the word had gotten out the way words always get out when the information is interesting enough, and what got out was this: the county had investigated May Holt's operation and found it not only legal, but in the unofficial opinion of the man who conducted the inspection, impressively organized. This piece of information traveled through Hardin County in both directions at once. It reassured the farmers who had been bringing May their dead equipment that they were not participating in something illicit, and it infuriated Frank Harmon in a way that was quiet and deep and did not show on his face at the co-op on Saturday mornings. He still called it the junkyard. He said the word with the particular inflection that makes a description sound like a verdict, and the name stuck the way names stick in small communities, permanently and without formal adoption. People giving directions past the Holt property said turn left at the junkyard. People mentioning May at the feed mill said, "You mean the junkyard woman?" Children riding the school bus called it the junk farm. May never objected. She never defended herself. She went to the barn in the evenings and kept working. By 1978, the spiral notebook listed 1,847 parts. The barn was full. May had begun organizing an overflow system in the machine shed, running new shelves along 2 walls and installing additional hooks along the rafters for larger components. The ravine held more than 50 pieces of dead equipment. A man driving past the property and looking north could see the rows of iron carcasses lined up in the gully, rusting in their orderly arrangements, which looked from a distance like nothing so much as a small cemetery. The comparison was not accidental. May had thought about it. She had thought about what it meant to preserve the remains of things that had done their work and given out. There was something in it that felt important to her, though she had never tried to articulate it to anyone. One evening in the fall of 1978, Gus came into the barn while May was labeling a set of brake shoes from a Farmall 806 that had arrived that week from a farm being sold up north. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the shelves, at the coffee cans, at the organized density of the system May had built over 12 years in this building. He said, "Do you need another shed?" May looked at him. She said, "Yes. I was going to ask you about that." Gus nodded. He looked around the barn one more time with the deliberate attention of a man taking measurements in his head. "I'll start the foundation next week," he said. He turned and walked back to the house. May looked at the brake shoes in her hand. She set them down on the workbench and looked at the barn around her. The shelves she had built, the systems she had developed, the 12 years of evening work that had accumulated into something she hadn't entirely planned, but had always in some way she couldn't fully explain known was coming. She picked up the grease pencil and wrote the label. She pressed it onto the first brake shoe, carefully making sure the adhesion was good. She set it on the shelf, she picked up the second brake shoe, and started again. Outside in the ravine, more than 50 pieces of dead equipment waited in their rows, organized and labeled, holding their parts the way a library holds its books, not for now, but for whenever the right person arrived and needed exactly what was there. In 1978, nobody needed them urgently. In 1978, you could still drive to Frank Harmon's dealership and buy a new fuel injector for a Farmall 706 for $68 and drive home with a box from the parts counter and a receipt in your pocket and the comfortable feeling of a man who has solved his problem the normal way. The normal way was still available in 1978. That was still true. But Mayholt had been watching the land long enough to know that the thing that is always true today is sometimes the first thing to become false tomorrow. She had seen a drought take a crop in 3 weeks. She had seen a market turn in 3 days. She had seen a good tractor die in an afternoon. She knew that the world had a way of changing faster than the people in it expected. So she kept going to the barn every evening. She kept disassembling and cleaning and testing and labeling. She kept filling the coffee cans and updating the notebook. She kept adding rows to the ravine, organized by manufacturers standing straight in the Iowa earth. And the county kept calling it the junkyard. And Mayholt kept not caring what the county called it. Because she had looked at those rows of dead machines and she had seen something that Frank Harmon and the men at the co-op and the neighbors who shook their heads had not seen. She had seen what those machines still contained. She had seen the value that remained when the obvious value was gone. She had seen parts still waiting to be useful inside frames that everyone had decided were finished. She saw it clearly. She had always seen it clearly. She was just waiting for the rest of the county to catch up. There is a particular kind of pride that grows in prosperous places during prosperous times. It is not the loud flag-waving kind of pride that announces itself. It is quieter than that. It lives in the way a man walks into a dealership and signs a purchase order without flinching. It lives in the new equipment parked in rows at the county fair, gleaming under the August sun, while farmers walk the lines and talk horsepower and hydraulic capacity and trade-in values. It lives in the assumption, unexamined, almost cellular, that next year will resemble this year, that the systems that have always worked will keep working, that the ground beneath your feet is as solid as it appears. Hardin County had that kind of pride in the late 1970s. Corn prices were high, land values were climbing. The Extension Office was publishing reports about the bright future of American agriculture, and the banks were reading those reports and lending money against land valuations that had doubled in a decade. And the farmers were borrowing against those valuations to buy more land and more equipment. And Frank Harmon was selling John Deere machinery at a pace that required him to hire 2 additional mechanics for his service department and expand his parts warehouse by 30%. 22 new tractors sold in Hardin County in 1979. 22. Frank Harmon shook hands on every one of those sales personally. He remembered the number precisely because he mentioned it regularly at the co-op, the way a man mentions a personal record, not boasting exactly, but making sure the number was known, was on the record, was part of the official accounting of what Frank Harmon had built in this county. Mayholt sold nothing in 1979. She gave parts away. She traded parts for fence work and grain, and on one occasion several hours of tractor time from a neighbor who needed a steering cylinder for a Farmall 706 and had nothing but labor to offer. She updated her notebook. She built the second shed with Gus, working evenings and weekends through the spring, framing it herself, and letting Gus handle the roof because Gus was better on a roof than she was, and both of them knew it. By the end of 1979, the second shed had 4 walls of shelving and a dirt floor that May swept every Saturday morning. The notebook listed 2,312 parts by the end of that year. She was not thinking about 1979 the way Frank Harmon was thinking about 1979. She was not thinking about records or sales figures or the expanding optimism of American agricultural credit. She was thinking about the hydraulic cylinder she had pulled from an Oliver 77. Oh, that afternoon, and whether the seals were still good and what model series she should cross-reference it under in the notebook. She was thinking about the long term. She had always been thinking about the long term. The long term arrived in 1982, and it arrived with the force and the indifference of a weather system that does not negotiate. Interest rates hit 21.5%. Not gradually, not with warning signs that gave a man time to adjust his position and protect what he had built. Quickly, the way the temperature drops when a front moves through. The Federal Reserve was fighting inflation, and the instrument it used to fight inflation was interest rates, and the casualty of that instrument was the American farmer who had borrowed money at 9% against land that was now worth 60% of what it had been worth when he borrowed, and who was now being asked to service that debt at a rate that turned every bushel of corn he grew into a payment on an obligation that was growing faster than the corn. Corn prices collapsed. Land values dropped. Banks that had been generous in the good years became precise and unforgiving in the bad ones, which is the nature of banks and always has been. Between 1982 and 1987, 300,000 American farms went into default. Hardin County lost nearly a quarter of its active operations in 3 years. May watched it happen from her property, which sat on the east side of the county and had a view north and west across fields that she had known all her life. She watched the auction signs go up. She watched the equipment get sold off piece by piece in the cold air of February mornings while the farmers and their wives stood back from the crowd with the particular stillness of people witnessing the dismantling of something they had built and believed in. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not say anything to anyone about any of it. She went to the barn in the evenings and updated the notebook and kept the shelves organized and swept the second shed on Saturday mornings. Gus watched the county go through what it was going through and said little. He sat with May at the kitchen table after supper, and they drank coffee and read the same Des Moines Register that was covering the crisis with the faithful, slightly bewildered attention of journalists who had not seen it coming either. Sometimes he looked across the table at May with an expression that contained something he did not have quite the words for, something between recognition and a kind of quiet sorrow for the people they knew who were losing what they had. He never said out loud what they both knew, which was that the Holt farm was not in trouble. They had not borrowed against inflated land values. They had not purchased new equipment on credit. They had farmed 240 acres with used machinery that May maintained herself and sourced parts for out of her own barn, and their debt was minimal, and their operation was lean in the way that operations run by careful people tend to be lean. They had not borrowed because they had not needed to. They had not needed to because May had built something that made borrowing unnecessary. Frank Harmon's dealership told the story of the crisis in numbers. 22 new tractors in 1979, 11 in 1980, 7 in 1981, 4 in 1983, 2 in 1984, 0 in 1985, 0. Not a single new tractor sold in Hardin County in 1985. Frank survived on parts and service revenue, and then parts and service revenue began contracting too, because the farmers who were still operating were deferring every maintenance item that could be deferred, doing their own repairs when they could manage it, and buying aftermarket parts from catalogs when they couldn't afford dealer prices. Frank Harmon had spent 28 years building his dealership. He had built it on the belief that the American farmer would always need new equipment, and that the relationship between a man and his John Deere dealer was one of the permanent arrangements of agricultural life as reliable as the seasons. In August of 1985, Frank Harmon closed his dealership. He did it early on a weekday morning before the county was fully awake. The service bay was locked. The parts counter was cleared. The showroom, which had held somewhere between 3 and 8 new tractors at any given moment for the past 28 years, was empty. The John Deere sign came down. It left a clean rectangle on the side of the building where the paint behind it had not faded with the rest of the wall, a pale ghost of what had been there. By the time the Saturday morning crowd gathered at the co-op, the news had already made its full circuit of the county. Gus heard it at the feed mill on Friday afternoon and came home and told May. She was in the second shed reorganizing the International Harvester section following the arrival of 2 more machines that week. She listened to what Gus said. She set down the parts she was holding. She looked at the shelf in front of her for a moment. Then she said, "The farmers are going to need to find parts somewhere." Gus looked at her. She picked up the part again and put it on the shelf. That was the whole conversation. What neither of them said was that the nearest remaining dealer was now in Marshalltown, 45 minutes away, and that even Marshalltown did not reliably stock parts for equipment that was more than 10 years old because dealers stock parts for the machines they currently sell, and nobody in Hardin County had bought a new machine recently, which meant the machines that needed parts were the old ones, which were exactly the machines the dealers had stopped stocking parts for. There was a gap, a serious one. It had been opening slowly for 3 years, and Frank Harmon's closed door had made it visible. Dale Pruitt was the first one to drive up Mays Lane. He came on a Tuesday morning in September of 1985. 3 weeks after the dealership closed, 3 weeks into the harvest window that would determine whether his operation survived another year. He drove a pickup truck that had seen better decades, and he parked it beside the barn and sat in it for a moment before getting out. He had almost not come. He had sat at his kitchen table for 3 days working through the options. He had called Marshalltown. They didn't have the part and said 4 to 6 weeks on order, which was a polite way of saying the harvest would be over before the part arrived. He had called 2 dealers in neighboring counties. Same story. He had looked through 2 catalogs from aftermarket suppliers and found nothing that matched his specifications. He had arrived at May Holt's name the way a man arrives at the last option on a list, not with enthusiasm, but with the particular resignation of someone who has exhausted everything else. And he had sat with that option for 3 days before acting on it because there was something in it that required him to set aside a feeling he had carried without examining it for most of his adult life. Dale Pruitt was not a man who asked women for help with machinery. This was not a position he had ever articulated or defended. It simply was. It was part of the furniture of his assumptions installed before he was old enough to question the installation, and it had never been seriously challenged because the situation had never previously arisen. Women did not know about machinery. This was a fact in Dale Pruitt's world, the way gravity was a fact, not because he had tested it, but because it had never needed testing. His Farmall 706 had a failed fuel injector. His harvest was 3 weeks away. The fact that sat across from that need at the kitchen table over 3 days of bad coffee and mounting anxiety was that the only person in Hardin County who might have the part he needed was a woman in a barn on the east end of the county. He got out of the truck. May was in the barn when he came to the door. She looked up from the workbench, registered who it was, and waited. Dale stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands. He told her what he needed. Farmall 706 fuel injector, and he told her what Marshalltown had said, and he told her about the harvest window. May set down her grease pencil. She walked to the back of the barn without speaking. Second shelf from the top, third section from the right. She reached into a coffee can, large label written in block letters, black marker on white tape, and produced 2 fuel injectors. She set them both on the workbench in front of Dale and stepped back. Both clean, she said. Both tested. Both ready to go in. Dale looked at the injectors. He looked at the coffee can. He looked at the shelf behind May, which ran the full length of the back wall and held perhaps 40 more cans of various sizes, each one labeled in the same precise hand. How much, he said. May looked at him. What can you afford, she said. Dale thought about it honestly, which is to say, he thought about what was actually in his account and what he could part with without consequences he couldn't handle. $12, he said. May nodded. Take the one on the left, she said. The seals are slightly newer. Dale picked up the injector. He turned it in his hands. It was clean and tight, and it looked exactly like the injectors he had purchased new from Frank Harmon's parts counter over the years, except that it had clearly come from inside an engine rather than out of a box, and it was being sold to him by a woman in a canvas jacket in a barn that smelled of oil and old iron and organized labor. He paid the $12. He drove home. He installed the injector himself in under an hour, which he could do because he had put enough of these in over the years to know the procedure without looking it up. The 706 fired up clean on the first crank and ran without complaint, and Dale Pruitt stood in his shed listening to it for a moment before he shut it off. He went inside and told his wife where he had gotten the part. His wife, who had grown up 2 farms over from the Holt property and had known May for 40 years, did not appear surprised. By Friday of that week, 3 more farmers had driven up Mays Lane. By the end of September 11th, the word was moving through the county now with genuine urgency because the urgency was real, and the need was real, and the fact that the need was being met by a woman in a barn and that the county had spent 20 years calling a junkyard was something people were setting aside in the way that practical people set aside their theories when the theories stopped producing useful results. May handled every visit the same way. She listened to what was needed. She went to the shelves. She came back with the part, or she came back without it, and told the farmer what the closest substitute might be and where they could find it. She charged what people could pay. She turned no one away. By Christmas of 1985, she had supplied parts to 37 farms across Hardin County and two neighboring counties: fuel injectors, hydraulic pumps, PTO shafts, water pumps, alternators, starter motors, brake shoes, steering cylinders, gauge clusters, seat springs, exhaust manifolds. Parts that were unavailable at any dealer within 100 miles. Parts that had been sitting in May's coffee cans and cardboard boxes and on May's shelves for years waiting. The notebook for 1985 showed 142 parts distributed. The average price per part was $33.80. The same parts new would have cost an average of $150 each. May had saved the farms of Hardin County more than $16,000 in a year, when $16,000 was the difference for some of those farms between staying and going. She was not getting rich. She was covering her property taxes and keeping the operation running, which was more than a considerable number of her neighbors could say that year. But the money was not the thing. It had never been the thing. What was happening was something harder to quantify. Mayholt had spent 20 years building something that the county had decided was useless, and the county was now learning in the specific and uncomfortable way that you learn things when there is no alternative available, that the thing they had called useless was the only thing that worked. There was a cost to that learning, not for May, for the people doing the learning. When a farmer couldn't pay, May traded labor for parts, grain for parts, time for parts. One farmer from the next county over paid for a complete set of brake shoes with a full day's worth of fence repair along the north field. Another paid for a steering cylinder with 2 bushels of winter squash and a handshake, and a look on his face that May recognized from every other face that had come through that barn door, the look of a man who has needed help and received it and does not entirely know how to carry that fact, because the needing was itself unexpected, and the source of the help was not what he had expected either. May took what was offered and made nothing of the look. Caleb was 19 years old in 1987. He had graduated from high school the previous spring and had spent the summer and fall working the farm with Gus and spending his evenings in the barn with May, which was where he had always gravitated when there was nothing specific required of him elsewhere. He had been accepted to an agricultural program at Iowa State. The letter had come in April. May had put it on the kitchen table without comment and waited to see what Caleb would do with it. What Caleb did with it was to let it sit on the kitchen table for 2 weeks, which was a form of decision-making that he had inherited from his father, and then one evening he came into the barn while May was rebuilding a water pump for a Farmall 560 and told her he wasn't going. May did not look up from the water pump. She said, "Why?" He said, "Because what you're doing here is going to need somebody who knows it. And in 4 years, if I go learn things I can learn from books, this barn is going to have 4 more years of inventory and no succession plan." May set down the pump housing. She looked at her son, who was standing in the doorway of the barn, the way his father stood in doorways with the same patient wait and the same clear eyes and the same absolute absence of drama about whatever he was saying. She said, "Your grandfather is going to say you're making a mistake." Caleb said, "I know." She said, "What are you going to tell him?" He thought about it. He said, "I'm going to tell him that some people learn things from classrooms and some people learn them from barns, and I've already been in the better classroom." May looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "The water pump housing needs new seals before the gasket goes on. You know where the seal inventory is." Caleb walked to the shelf without looking for it. He found the seals in 30 seconds. Gus was not happy about Caleb's decision. He said so plainly once at the kitchen table, and Caleb listened and did not argue, and Gus did not repeat himself because he had said what he meant, and he was not a man who repeated himself. But that evening, May found Gus in the second shed standing in front of the IH section, reading the labels on a row of coffee cans with the focused attention of a man who was trying to understand a system. He did not say anything when she came in. She stood beside him and they looked at the shelves together for a moment. Then Gus said, "He's not wrong." May said no. They stood there a little longer. Then Gus went back to the house and May went back to the barn, and Caleb was there when she arrived, the water pump already assembled and labeled on the workbench, ready for whoever needed it. One morning in March of 1986, a truck pulled into the Holt lane that May recognized before she recognized the driver. It was a blue Ford pickup, older now than the last time she had seen it moving through the county, and on its door was the faint rectangular outline of a decal that had been removed not recently but not so long ago that the clean square of protected paint behind it had fully faded to match the rest of the door. The outline said, if you knew what it had said, Harmon Implement, John Deere Sales and Service, Eldora, Iowa. Frank Harmon got out of the truck. He was 61 years old, and he looked like a man who had spent the last 7 months learning something painful. He had kept the land behind the closed dealership. He was farming it himself now, which was something he had not done seriously in 30 years, and farming it with equipment that was older than he would have previously considered acceptable, because acceptable had changed along with everything else. He stood beside his truck and looked at the barn. Then he walked to the door. May was inside reorganizing the John Deere section. She heard the door and had looked up and saw Frank Harmon standing at the entrance to her barn for the first time in the 20 years that she had been building what was in it. She waited. Frank looked at the shelves. He looked at the coffee cans. He looked at the labeling, at the organization, at the sheer volume of what was stored in this building that he had called an eyesore and a safety hazard, and a symptom of a woman who did not understand how commerce and agriculture properly related to one another. He looked at it with the particular attention of a man who is seeing something he has heard described many times and is finding that the description, whatever its content, did not prepare him for the actual scale and precision of the thing itself. He looked for a long time. Then he said, I need a steering cylinder for a 402. Oh, his voice was level. He was a man who had spent his career presenting himself as capable and certain, and the habit held even now, even here, even in front of the woman whose barn he had campaigned against for 2 decades. But his hands were not entirely steady when he named the price he had been quoted in Des Moines. $185, he said, and they said 3 weeks on delivery. May looked at him for a moment. Just a moment. Then she walked past him through the barn into the second shed. She was gone, perhaps 2 minutes. When she came back, she was carrying a steering cylinder for a John Deere 4020. She set it on the workbench. Clean, she said. Tested. Seals are good. Frank looked at the cylinder. He looked at May. How much, he said. $20, May said. Frank reached for his wallet. His movements were deliberate, controlled the movements of a man managing himself carefully under circumstances that were testing that management. He put a $20 bill on the workbench. May picked it up, folded it, and put it in the front pocket of her canvas jacket. They stood on opposite sides of the workbench in the barn that Frank Harmon had tried to get the county to shut down, in the barn that he had called an eyesore, in the barn that he had used as a recurring example of everything that was wrong about a woman making decisions that men were supposed to make. The barn that was full, organized, operational, and needed, while his dealership stood empty on the main road into Eldora, with a pale rectangle on the wall where the sign used to be. May looked at Frank Harmon. She said, I want you to know something, Frank. I did not build this to prove you wrong. I built it because I could see what was in these machines when other people had stopped looking. I did not know when it would matter or who would need it. I just knew that someday the things everyone was throwing away were going to be the things someone desperately needed. She paused. She said, the only difference between junk and a part is whether someone needs it today. Frank Harmon did not respond. He picked up the steering cylinder from the workbench. He walked to the door of the barn. He stopped there for a moment with his back to her, looking out at the lane and the ravine beyond it, where decades of dead equipment stood in organized rows, rusting quietly in the Iowa light. Then he walked to his truck and drove away. May stood in the doorway and watched the blue Ford go back down the lane and turn onto the county road and disappear behind the tree line to the west. Then she went back into the barn. She picked up her grease pencil. She went back to the John Deere section and kept working. And somewhere out there on farms across Hardin County and beyond, machines were running that should not have been running. Harvests were happening that might not have happened. Operations were surviving another season that might otherwise not have survived, because 20 years ago, a woman with a canvas jacket and a grease pencil in a ravine full of dead machinery had looked at what everyone else was throwing away and had seen with complete and unshakable clarity exactly what it was worth. The farm crisis did not end on a specific day. It eased the way a fever eases gradually, unevenly, with setbacks that made you wonder if the improvement had been real. And then slowly, undeniably, the numbers began to move in a direction that allowed people to breathe again without calculating the cost of the breath. By the late 1980s, corn prices had recovered slightly. A severe drought in 1988 had, with the particular irony of agricultural economics, helped the farmers who survived it by reducing supply enough to push commodity prices upward. Some families who had held on through the worst years began to see daylight. A new implement dealer opened in Iowa Falls, 20 miles north, carrying a modest line of equipment. The county's auction signs came down with less frequency. May Holt's barn did not slow down. This surprised people who had assumed that her operation was a crisis response, a temporary utility that had served its purpose, and would now gradually return to irrelevance as normal commerce resumed. What those people had not accounted for was that something had changed in Hardin County during the crisis years, something that went deeper than the economics and would not reverse itself when the economics improved. Farmers had learned to think differently about old equipment. For 20 years before the crisis, the prevailing logic had been straightforward. New is better, newer is best, and the proper relationship with old machinery is to trade it before it becomes a problem. The crisis had demolished that logic with the blunt efficiency of a machine that does not care about the beliefs of the person standing in front of it. What the crisis had taught and what could not be untaught was that a fuel injector pulled from a 20-year-old tractor by a woman who had cleaned it and tested it and stored it carefully in a labeled coffee can was precisely as useful as a fuel injector in a box from a parts counter and cost a fraction as much and was available when the boxed version was not. The value of a part is not in its newness. The value of a part is in its function, and function is preserved by care, not by manufacture date. May had been saying this in her own way for 2 decades. She had said it by building a system that embodied the principle in every labeled can, in every organized shelf, and every careful entry in the notebook. And now the county understood it, not because May had persuaded anyone, but because circumstance had done the persuading for her. By 1989, Caleb was managing significant portions of the barn operation independently, while May focused on acquisition. He could locate any part in the barn within a minute. He could identify most farm-all components by feel alone, a skill his mother had not explicitly taught him, but which had developed naturally from years of handling the inventory. He had his mother's hands by then. The same deliberate roughness, the same grease in the knuckles that did not fully wash out, the same way of holding a part and turning it slowly that was less inspection than it was a kind of reading. In 1990, May spent 2 weekends in October doing what she called a reset, walking every row in the ravine, reassessing condition and organization, moving pieces that had been placed quickly during the crisis years back to their proper positions. She counted while she walked. 78 equipment carcasses, arranged by manufacturer, International Harvester on the north side, John Deere on the south, everything else in the middle. The barn held 3,012 catalog parts. The second shed held another 1,400. The machine shed overflow held 300 more. She sat with those numbers for a moment at the workbench. Then she opened the notebook and began updating it. By 1991, Caleb suggested a third dedicated shed. He brought it up at supper, the way decisions got made in the Holt household, plainly without preamble. "We're running out of organized space," he said. "The machine shed overflow isn't working. It's slowing retrieval down." May looked at Gus. Gus said, "There's a good site on the south side of the main barn. Level ground, good drainage." That was the conversation. By June, the third shed was framed. By August, it had shelves. Ruth Dennison, who had told May 25 years earlier that the junk farm was causing more embarrassment than it was worth, had by now become something she would not have predicted for herself, a reliable presence in the barn on the afternoons when May and Caleb were out in the field. She had learned the catalog well enough to answer basic inquiries. She knew where the Farmall hydraulics were and where the John Deere steering components were and where to find the notebook when someone needed to cross-reference a part number. She had been wrong about something important and had admitted it privately to May, and May had received the admission with the grace of a person who had never needed it to know she was right. They did not speak of it again. They did not need to. It was Gus in the end who acted first on the question of public recognition. In the spring of 1992, without telling May, He was going to do it. He drove to the county directory office in Eldora and placed an advertisement. He had written it out at the kitchen table the night before on a piece of notebook paper in the careful block letters of a man who did not write often but understood precision when it mattered. Holt Farm Equipment Salvage. Used parts for all makes, fair prices. Caleb and May Holt, Hardin County. He paid for it himself. He drove home. He set the receipt on the kitchen table and sat down and poured himself coffee and waited. May came in from the barn an hour later, saw the receipt and picked it up. She read it. She set it back down. She looked at Gus across the table. He was looking at his coffee. She went to the counter and poured herself a cup and came back and sat down, and they drank together in the kitchen of the farmhouse her grandfather had built in 1901, in the silence that had always been the primary language of their marriage, and which had always carried more information than most people's conversations. The advertisement generated more response than anyone had anticipated. Phone calls came from farmers, but also from tractor collectors in Minnesota and Wisconsin looking for specific vintage parts. A man in Nebraska wrote a letter, a physical letter with a stamp, asking about a dashboard cluster for a 1949 Farmall M. May had two. She sent him one packed carefully in newspaper with a handwritten note describing the condition of each component and what to watch for during installation. An agricultural museum in Nebraska wrote to ask if May could supply a PTO assembly for a restoration project. May shipped it free of charge with documentation of its provenance, what machine it had come from, what year, what county. The museum wrote back and said they had never received a donated part with that quality of documentation. A vocational school in Des Moines called and asked if they could bring students to the Holt barn for a field visit. May said yes. 23 students arrived on a Saturday in October. They were young, most of them in their late teens, training in agricultural mechanics, and they walked into the barn with the slightly skeptical attention of people who have been told they are about to see something instructive and are prepared to be politely unimpressed. They came out of it differently. May spent 4 hours with them. She walked them through the catalog system. She showed them how a part was assessed when it arrived, how it was cleaned and tested, and labeled, how it was entered in the notebook and located on the shelf. She showed them a Farmall 46. Oh, she was in the process of disassembling, and she walked them through the sequence. What comes off first, why, what to preserve, and what to let go. How to read a machine for what it still contains rather than what it has lost. At the end of the visit, one of the students asked May when she had decided to start all of this. May thought about the question. She said, "I did not decide to start it. I decided not to throw away what was still good." That is a different kind of decision. One of them requires you to have a plan. The other just requires you to pay attention. The student wrote this down. May noticed. She did not say anything about it. Gus Holt died in February of 1999. He was 86 years old. He had farmed for 60 years, built 2 sheds and a set of shelves and an advertisement that had reached further than he had intended, and had been married to May for 58 years without once in any of those years feeling the need to understand everything she was doing in order to support it. His funeral was small the way he had wanted. The people who came were the people who had known him well, which in Gus Holt's case meant the people who had been paying close attention for a long time, because Gus was not a man who made himself easy to know quickly. He was a man who rewarded patience, and the people at his funeral had been patient, and they were genuinely grieving. May did not cry in front of anyone. This was not coldness. It was the same privacy she brought to everything that mattered deeply to her, a sense that the most important things were not for public display. Not because they were shameful, but because they were hers, genuinely and completely hers, and sharing them would have reduced them in some way she could not explain. That evening, after the last car had left the farm, Caleb went to the barn to give his mother space and to do the only useful thing he could think of, which was to keep the operation running, because that was what Gus would have wanted and what May would want when she was ready to want anything again. He found her already there. She was at the workbench under the work light with a coffee can in front of her. She was removing the label, a strip of masking tape with writing that had faded over years of handling until it was barely legible, and replacing it with a fresh one. New tape, new label, the same contents, the same organization, but renewed. Caleb stood in the doorway. He could see even from that distance that the handwriting on the new label was not his mother's handwriting. It was Gus's. He had left her samples, block letters and grease pencil. Somewhere in the house there were pieces of paper with Gus's handwriting on them, practice labels or notes or the simple residue of a life lived with a pen in hand, and May had found them, and she was using them, transferring his hand to the cans that would outlast them both. Caleb did not go into the barn. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he turned and went back to the house and made supper and left a plate warming in the oven for whenever his mother came in. She came in at 10 o'clock. She ate. She washed her plate. She went to bed. She was in the barn by 6 the next morning. May Holt died in March of 2003. She was 90 years old. She had farmed 240 acres for 62 years and had spent 37 of those years building something in a barn and a ravine that the county had called useless, and that had turned out to be the opposite of useless at the moment when usefulness mattered most. She had never borrowed money for equipment. She had never purchased a new tractor. She had driven the same succession of used farmalls her entire farming life, each one sourced partly from the parts she had pulled from machines in the ravine, assembled and maintained by her own hands, running on her own knowledge. She had never required anyone's validation. She had not built the barn for validation. She had built it because she could see what was in the machines when other people had stopped looking, and because she was constitutionally incapable of throwing away what was still good. The inventory at the time of her death, 6,041 catalog parts in 3 storage buildings, 78 equipment carcasses in the ravine, organized by a manufacturer, 12 volumes of notebooks cross-indexed covering every part acquired, distributed, or currently held over 37 years. The handwriting in volumes 1 through 9 was May's. The handwriting in volumes 10 through 12 was Caleb's, with May reviewing and correcting in the margins in the years when her hands had begun to trouble her. Caleb took over the farm in the salvage operation without a transition period because there was no gap to transition across. He had been running significant portions of it for 15 years. The knowledge was in him the way the knowledge of a place gets into a person who has worked it long enough, not as information he could separately recall, but as instinct, as the body's understanding of where things are and what they mean and how they fit together. He was 35 years old. He had the barn, the 3 sheds, the ravine, the 12 notebooks, and 20 years of relationships with farmers across central Iowa who knew that if Caleb Holt didn't have what you needed, it probably wasn't available within 100 miles. The answer was almost always yes. May had made sure of that. In the spring of 2008, a reporter from the Des Moines Register drove out to the Holt property to write a feature story. Her name was Patricia Voss, and she had been covering agricultural issues in Iowa for 11 years, and she had heard about the Holt salvage yard from 3 different sources in 3 different counties before she made the call to arrange the visit. She spent most of a day at the farm. She walked the ravine. She went through all 3 storage buildings. She sat at the workbench with Caleb and went through the notebooks, all 12 volumes, starting from the first entry in 1966 and reading forward through 37 years of acquisitions and distributions and cross-references in May's careful hand, and then in Caleb's with May's corrections in the margins, growing less frequent in the final volumes as Caleb's knowledge had grown to match his mother's. She counted the coffee cans on the shelves of the main barn. There were 412. She opened one at random. It was labeled in block letters, black marker on white tape, IH560 thermostat housings. Inside were 6 thermostat housings, each one clean, each one wrapped in a strip of cloth, each one waiting. She asked Caleb questions for 2 hours. She asked about May. She asked about the crisis years. She asked about Frank Harmon, who had died in 1994, and about Gary Meeks, who was still alive and still remembered his inspection visit with the clarity of a man who has told the story often enough that it has settled into its final form. At the end of the afternoon, Patricia Voss asked Caleb a question she had been saving. She said, "What is the most valuable thing in this barn?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. He looked around the main barn at the shelves, at the coffee cans, at the organized density of 37 years of his mother's work and 15 years of his own layered on top of it. Then he stood up. He walked to the east wall, to the back of the barn, to the original shelving unit that Gus had built in 1966, which was still standing and still sound because Gus had built it to last, and it had. First shelf, first row. He reached up and took down a coffee can. It was a Folgers can, the large size its original label long since faded to near illegibility, The masking tape label adhered over it in block letters that Patricia Voss could read from where she stood. IIH460 injectors. Caleb held it for a moment before he opened it. He said, "This is the first can my mother ever labeled. The machine it came from was a Farmall 460 with a cracked block. A farmer named Joe Cutter was going to sell it for scrap. My mother asked for it instead and spent a weekend taking it apart on her own in 1966, when nobody in this county thought a woman had any business being inside a tractor engine." He opened the can, he reached in and removed the single object inside. A fuel injector clean wrapped in cloth with a small strip of masking tape on the cloth. The writing on the tape was faded but legible. May's hand, 1966, one injector. The last one. In 37 years of operation and hundreds of transactions and distributions and trades and gifts, this one injector had remained in this can on this shelf. Not because it was unusable, not because it had been overlooked, because at some point May had looked at it and understood what it was, not simply a fuel injector from a Farmall 460, but the first piece of the thing she had built, and the evidence that the thing had started exactly where it needed to start, with a single part that someone else had given up on, taken apart carefully by a woman who had not given up on it, cleaned and tested and labeled and stored against the day when someone would need it. Caleb held it up in the light of the barn. "This," he said. Patricia Voss looked at the injector in his hand. She said, "Why this one?" Caleb thought about how his mother would have answered that question. He thought about the way she answered questions in general, directly, without ornament, in the fewest words that contained the complete truth. He said, "Because it's where everything started." One woman looked at a dead machine and saw what was still alive inside it. She spent the next 37 years acting on that. That is the whole story. Patricia Voss wrote the story. It ran on a Sunday in June of 2008 with the headline, "The Farm That Saves Farms." The subheading read, "How One Iowa Family's Salvage Yard Became the Last Resort for a County's Worth of Tractor Parts, and Why the Woman Who Built It Spent 20 Years Being Called the Junkyard Farmer." The story mentioned May. It mentioned the ravine and the notebooks and the coffee cans and the crisis years and Frank Harmon and the 37 farmers who had come through that barn before Christmas of 1985. It mentioned Dale Pruitt, who was still farming at 78, and who told the reporter that the $12 he had paid May Holt for a fuel injector in September of 1985 was the best $12 he had spent in 60 years of farming. It mentioned Caleb and Mason, who was Caleb's son, 12 years old in 2008, already spending his after-school hours in the barn the way his father had, the way his grandmother had before his father. The letters came for 3 months after the story ran. Farmers from across Iowa, a man in Kansas who had read the piece and wrote to say that his grandmother had done something similar in a smaller way during the Depression, saving parts from dead equipment on the family place, and that he had thought of her the entire time he was reading. A woman in Michigan doing something like what May had done, not with tractors, but with industrial sewing machines, who wanted to ask Caleb about the cataloging system. A retired agricultural extension officer who wrote to say that May Holt's operation was the most efficient example of informal part salvage he had encountered in 40 years of work, and that it was a shame nobody had studied it while she was alive. Caleb answered every letter. It took him most of the winter. Mason Holt joined the operation formally in 2016. He was 20 years old and had his grandmother's eyes and his grandfather's patience and his father's hands, and he had grown up in the barn the way 3 generations of his family had grown up in it, not as visitors or observers, but as participants, absorbing the system from the inside, learning it, the way you learn the geography of the place you live through daily contact over years. He had one skill the previous generations had not had. He understood computers. He spent the winter of 2016 creating a digital catalog of the entire inventory, entering every item from the 12 notebook volumes into a database that could be searched by make, model, part name, condition, and acquisition date. It took him 4 months of evenings. When it was done, he showed it to Caleb. Caleb looked at the screen for a long time. He navigated to the first entry. May Holt 1966, Farmall 460, hydraulic pump condition good. He looked at it the way his mother had looked at the shelves in the barn, with the focused cataloging attention of someone reading something that contained more than its surface suggested. He said, "The notebooks stay." Mason said, "Of course." The 12 volumes of handwritten notebooks went into a fireproof cabinet in the farmhouse where they remain. May's handwriting in the first 9, Caleb's in the last 3. May's corrections in the margins growing sparser in the final pages as her son grew into the knowledge that had been hers alone. The ravine is full now. The main barn is full. The second shed is full. The third shed is full. There is a fourth structure going up on the south side of the property framed by Caleb and Mason over 2 weekends in the fall, the same way Gus had framed the second shed 40 years ago, the same cedar posts and corrugated roof built to last. Every week, without exception, at least one farmer drives up the lane that runs past the ravine that the county called a junkyard for 20 years, that the county depended on during the years when depending on it was the only option, and that the county now calls simply and accurately the Holt Salvage Yard. The farmer parks beside the main barn and walks to the door and tells Caleb or Mason what he needs. The answer is almost always yes. It was always almost yes. Mayhold had spent 37 years making sure of that one part at a time, one labeled coffee can at a time, one evening in the barn, at a time accumulating what everyone else was throwing away against the day when throwing it away would turn out to have been the wrong decision. She had seen what was in the dead machines when other people had stopped looking. She had seen it clearly. She had always seen it clearly, and she had built something to hold it until the rest of the world caught up. On the east wall of the main barn, on the first shelf in the first row, a Folgers coffee can sits where it has sat since 1966. The masking tape label is old now. The adhesive faded, the writing in May Holt's hand still legible to anyone who takes it down and holds it in the light. IAU 460 injectors. Inside one injector. Clean. Wrapped in cloth. Still there. Still waiting.